November 11th, 1350, Northern England, the Feast of St. Martin, a date that would be forgotten by history but was everything to those who lived it. When people complain today about their heating going out for a day, about a cold draft from a window, about having to wear socks indoors, they have no concept of true cold, real cold, the kind that kills quietly and efficiently, the kind that doesn't care about your hopes or your plans or your children's futures. Medieval winter wasn't an inconvenience to be complained about on social media. It wasn't a minor disruption to your comfortable routine. It was a death sentence waiting to be served on anyone who made a single miscalculation, a single mistake in preparation or judgment. The Little Ice Age had transformed Europe into a frozen nightmare, and for families like the Fletchers, for millions of peasant families across the continent, survival wasn't guaranteed by any government program or social safety net. It wasn't assumed or expected. It was earned, day by brutal day, through knowledge and preparation and sheer stubborn refusal to give up. Before we dive in, if you're finding value in these historical deep dives, show some love with a like or subscribe. And hey, I'm always curious about my global audience. Drop a comment with where you're listening from and what time it is. It's wild knowing people all over the world are falling asleep to these stories. Now then, settle in. Get those blankets adjusted. Fluff those pillows. You're going to need the comfort, because we're about to experience medieval winter from the inside out. Think about your last winter. Really think about it. Maybe you complained about scraping ice off your windshield on a cold morning, standing there for 5 minutes shivering before you could drive to your heated office. Maybe your heating bill was higher than you'd like, and you had to adjust your budget slightly. Maybe you had to wear an extra sweater indoors because you kept the thermostat a few degrees lower to save money. Maybe the grocery store was out of your favorite fresh berries because they couldn't be shipped from South America that week. These are the inconveniences of modern winter. Annoyances that we grumble about, that we post about online, that we bond with co-workers over. Mild discomforts that we endure with the absolute certainty, never questioned, barely even conscious, that warmth, food, and safety are always just a thermostat adjustment away, just a trip to the store away, just a phone call to emergency services away if something goes wrong. Now forget all of that. Forget central heating. Forget insulated walls. Forget grocery stores stocked year-round with fresh produce shipped from warmer climates. Forget emergency services. Forget modern medicine. Forget weather forecasts that let you prepare for coming storms. Forget everything that makes winter survivable in the 21st century. What you're left with is medieval winter. Raw, unforgiving, deadly. The Little Ice Age, spanning roughly from the 14th to the 19th century, dropped global temperatures by an average of 2 degrees Celsius. 2 degrees. It doesn't sound like much, does it? We adjust our thermostats by more than that without thinking. But those 2 degrees meant the difference between a marginally successful harvest and widespread famine, between a survivable winter and mass death, between civilization maintaining its fragile hold and complete collapse into chaos. For the peasant farmers of medieval England, those 2 degrees represented an existential threat that returned every year with the falling leaves and shortening days. The cold hits first, always the cold. Thomas Fletcher's eyes open to darkness. Not the darkness of night, but the pre-dawn murk of late autumn. That peculiar grey-black that comes before sunrise on the shortest days of the year. The kind of darkness that seems to have weight, pressing down on you like a physical thing, 43 years old, ancient by medieval standards. Think about that for a moment. 43. In our modern world, that's barely middle age. People talk about their 40s as their prime years. But in 1350, Thomas Fletcher was considered old, an elder, a man who had beaten the odds simply by surviving this long. Most of his childhood friends were dead, some from disease, some from accidents, some from violence, some simply from the accumulated toll of hard labour and insufficient nutrition. His joints screamed protest as consciousness returned. The arthritis that had begun creeping into his knees and hands a few years ago was worse in the cold. Much worse. The packed earth floor beneath their crude bed radiated cold through the straw mattress like ice seeping through his bones. Not the clean, dry cold of a modern freezer, but a damp, penetrating cold that worked its way into your marrow and settled there like a parasite. Rough-hewn timber beams crossed overhead, blackened from years of smoke. The wood was oak, harvested from the Lord's forest decades ago when the cottage was built. Massive beams that would last for generations if the house itself survived. They were black now, coated with years of soot and creosote from the central fire that burned day and night for most of the year. The smell was familiar. Wood smoke, sharp and acrid. Damp straw, musty and organic. Cattle, the earthy animal scent of the beasts penned in the attached byre. Unwashed human bodies, because bathing in winter was rare and dangerous. Rendered animal fat from the rushlights. Old cooking odours embedded in the walls and floor. The faint sourness of the ale barrel in the corner. This was home. This was what safety smelled like. Beside him, Emma breathed steadily, her body warm against his despite the cold. Their youngest daughter Agnes was tucked between them for warmth, as she had been every night since the weather turned cold. The child was 6 years old, small for her age, and seemed to catch every illness that passed through the village. Emma worried about her constantly, though she never said so aloud. Voicing fears gave them power in the medieval mind. Somewhere in the dim light their other children shifted in their sleep. Margaret, 14, old enough to be married off if they could secure a decent match for her. She was a good girl, skilled with the loom and the needle, strong enough to work in the fields when needed. She would make some man a fine wife, and the bride price they could negotiate would help the family through a hard year when it came. William, also 14, Margaret's twin, though you wouldn't know it to look at them, was supposed to be tending the fire. Thomas could see his son's silhouette against the faint glow of embers in the central hearth. The boy had grown tall over the summer, shooting up like a weed, and now stood nearly as tall as Thomas himself. He was thin, though. They were all thin as autumn turned to winter. The harvest had been adequate, but barely so. There would be enough food to survive, but little margin for error or misfortune. Looks to be frost again. Thomas swung his legs over the edge of the bed platform, wincing as his feet met the floor. The cold shot up through his legs like knives. Heavy one too. William glanced up from the kindling he was arranging. The boy's hands moved with practised efficiency, building a small pyramid of thin twigs over the glowing embers. The pond was starting to freeze yesterday. Peter the miller says we're in for a hard winter. Of course he did. Peter the miller said that every year. But the boy was probably right. Thomas had been noticing it since childhood. The winters getting longer, colder, crueler. What he couldn't know was that historians would later call this the Little Ice Age, a period when temperatures dropped just 2 degrees. 2 degrees that meant the difference between survival and starvation for medieval farmers across Europe. Emma rose, wrapping a shawl around her shoulders with practised efficiency. No wasted movement. every action measured to conserve energy, conserve heat. She added a small log to the crackling fire. Not too much, never too much this early in the season. "Margaret!" Her voice cut through the morning quiet. "Come help with breakfast." Their eldest daughter emerged from beneath the blankets like a reluctant mole. The day ahead would be long, St. Martin's Day, Martinmas, the traditional beginning of true winter, marked by the slaughter of the animals that couldn't be fed through the cold months. Nothing would be wasted. Nothing could be wasted. Outside, the village was stirring despite the cold. Smoke rose from central hearths in each single-room dwelling, thin grey columns climbing into the pale November sky. From Thomas's doorway he could count 12 houses, all similar to his own. Small, cramped, built for survival rather than comfort. Wattle and daub construction, woven sticks coated with clay, straw and dung. It sounds primitive to modern ears, doesn't it? Walls made of sticks and dung. We wrinkle our noses at the thought, but those thick walls provided better insulation than you'd imagine. Better, in some ways, than many modern constructions. The woven sticks created a framework, flexible enough to move with the seasons without cracking, strong enough to support the roof. The daub mixture, that combination of clay, straw, and yes, animal dung, filled every gap and crack. As it dried, it created a barrier several inches thick that trapped air pockets within its matrix. Air is an excellent insulator. The medieval builders didn't understand the physics, but they understood the results. A well-built wattle and daub wall could keep a house tolerably warm with a single central fire, even in the depths of winter. The thatched roofs helped too. Layers of bundled straw or reed laid thick and tight, often 2 feet deep at the ridge. They shed rain and snow efficiently, and the air trapped within the thatch provided additional insulation. Of course, they also filled the houses with smoke because proper chimneys were a luxury unknown in peasant homes. The smoke had to find its way out through gaps in the roof and walls, and it did, eventually, but not before filling the interior with eye-watering, lung-burning haze. This was the price of warmth. Smoke-damaged eyes, chronic coughs, lungs that wheezed and rattled. But the alternative was freezing to death, so you endured the smoke and counted yourself lucky to have a fire at all. Thomas finished his breakfast of dark bread and ale quickly. The bread was coarse, made from a mixture of rye and barley with some ground peas mixed in to extend the flour. It was dark brown, almost black, and so dense it sat heavy in your stomach. The ale was weak, what we might call small ale, with barely enough alcohol to make it safer than water, but not enough to cause intoxication. This was breakfast for a working man. Calories to fuel a long day of physical labour. "William, make sure the wood pile is covered properly. The wood must stay dry." Firewood equaled life. This wasn't hyperbole or metaphor, it was simple fact. Each family needed several cords of wood to survive the season. A cord is a stack 4 feet high, 4 feet wide, and 8 feet long. Figure 3 to 5 cords per family for a winter, depending on the severity of the cold and the quality of the house's insulation. That's an enormous amount of wood. Hundreds of individual pieces, thousands of pounds. Gathering it had been a year-round task. Spring, summer, fall, every season except the deep winter itself. Collecting fallen branches and deadwood from the nearby forest. The lord of the manor allowed this by right of estover, an ancient custom that gave peasants the right to collect fallen wood for fuel. But cutting living trees, forbidden, severely punishable. The forests belonged to the lord. Every tree, every branch, every acorn. Taking living wood was theft. punishable by fines the average peasant could never hope to pay, or by physical punishment, mutilation, whipping, in extreme cases, death. Thomas had witnessed winters where desperate families, their wood piles depleted, their children freezing, made the terrible choice to cut green wood from living trees. Some were caught and punished. Others got away with it, but gained little benefit because green wood, full of moisture and sap, burns poorly and produces more smoke than heat. Some families, pushed beyond desperation, burned parts of their own homes for warmth. Door frames, shutters, floorboards, roof beams. Desperation makes criminals of honest people. Desperation makes people destroy their own futures for the sake of surviving one more day. "Father," William called from outside, his voice carrying in the still morning air. "John Cooper wants to know if you'll help with the pig slaughtering today." Thomas nodded, though William couldn't see him through the closed door. Of course he would help. That's how the village worked. Communal labour for communal tasks. You helped your neighbours slaughter their pig today, and they would help you with yours tomorrow. You helped raise your neighbour's roof beam in summer, and he would help you harvest your crops in autumn. This web of reciprocal obligations held the community together, made survival possible for families that would perish in isolation. Thomas nodded, though William couldn't see him through the closed door. Of course he would help. That's how the village worked. Communal labour for communal tasks. You helped your neighbours slaughter their pig today, and they would help you with yours tomorrow. You helped raise your neighbour's roof beam in summer, and he would help you harvest your crops in autumn. This web of reciprocal obligations held the community together, made survival possible for families that would perish in isolation. Martinmas meant slaughter. No fodder to keep all the livestock alive through the long winter months. The mathematics were brutal but simple. A pig eats roughly 3 to 5 pounds of food per day. Over a 5-month winter, that's 450 to 750 pounds of food. Food that the family didn't have. Food that they needed for themselves. So the pigs were slaughtered. The chickens that weren't laying anymore were killed. Old cows past their productive years were butchered. Only breeding stock and working animals would be spared. The one milk cow that provided dairy through the winter. The ox that would pull the plough in spring. The hens that were still laying eggs. The sow that would farrow in spring to provide next year's meat. Every other animal had to die so that the family could live. The village had been preparing for weeks, following a rhythm as old as agriculture itself. Root vegetables had been dug up from the garden plots and stored in cool, dry places. Turnips, parsnips, carrots, beets. These would last for months if kept properly, providing vitamins and calories through the barren winter. Cabbages had been harvested before the frost could claim them, their outer leaves left on for protection, then stored in the root cellar where the temperature stayed just above freezing. Grains, the staple of the medieval diet, had been threshed and winnowed and stored in vermin-proof containers, or as vermin-proof as medieval technology allowed. Mice and rats were a constant battle. They could devastate a family's grain supply in weeks if allowed access. So the grain was stored in chests raised off the ground on legs, in bags hung from rafters, in barrels that were checked daily for signs of gnawing or intrusion. Some families kept cats for mouse control, though feeding a cat through winter was another mouth to worry about. Some kept small dogs, some relied on traps and vigilance. None of these methods were perfect. Every family expected to lose some portion of their grain to vermin. The question was, how much? Lose 5% and you'd be fine. Lose 20% and you might starve before spring. Now came the final and most important task, preserving meat for the long months ahead. While Thomas headed to help with the communal slaughtering, pulling on his woolen tunic and wrapping his leg bindings tight against the cold, Emma and her daughters faced their own crucial work. The small garden plot yielded the last hardy herbs, the ones that could withstand the cold and even improve in flavour after a light frost. Rosemary, its needle-like leaves still green and fragrant. Thyme, tiny and potent. Sage, broad-leafed and silvery. These would flavour and help preserve winter foods. Herbs weren't just about taste in the medieval world. They were medicine, preservation, and sometimes magic all wrapped into one. Rosemary prevented meat from spoiling and helped with memory and concentration. Thyme fought infection and soothed coughs. Sage aided digestion and purified food that might be starting to turn. The apples had already been picked weeks ago, sorted carefully. The best specimens, unblemished and firm, were wrapped individually in straw and placed in the coolest corner of the house where they would last for months. The second best apples were being eaten now, fresh while they lasted. The damaged or wormy apples had been made into preserves or dried into leathery strips that would last indefinitely. Food preservation wasn't just cooking, it was chemistry, biology, art and science born of absolute necessity. Emma understood this on an intuitive level, even though she couldn't have explained the microbiology of bacterial growth or the chemical processes of salt curing. What she knew was that certain methods worked and certain methods didn't. Salt preserved meat. Smoking preserved meat. Drying preserved fruit. Honey preserved almost anything. Vinegar made things last longer. These were facts as reliable as the sun rising in the east. "We'll salt half the meat," Emma told Margaret as they worked, bundling herbs and tying them with twine to hang from the rafters. "The rest will smoke. Make sure the herbs are completely dry before we store them. Any moisture and they'll mould." Salt was expensive, precious, a commodity worth its weight in, well, not quite gold, but certainly silver. The Fletcher family had traded one of Emma's woven wool cloaks for a small sack of salt earlier in the year, back in summer when the travelling merchants came through. A cloak that had taken Emma weeks to weave, hours and hours of careful work at the loom, traded for perhaps 10 pounds of salt. It seems like a terrible exchange by modern economics. But that salt would mean the difference between protein and starvation come February. Salting meat properly was an art. You rubbed the cuts thoroughly with salt, working it into every surface, every crack, every crevice. Then you packed the meat in more salt, creating a barrier of pure sodium chloride around it. The salt drew out moisture through osmosis, drying the meat and creating an environment hostile to the bacteria they didn't know existed, but understood through hard experience killed meat and made it poisonous. A properly salted piece of pork could last for months, even years. When you wanted to use it, you soaked it in water to remove some of the salt, then cooked it. It would be incredibly salty by modern standards, almost inedibly so. But it would be edible when the alternative was starvation. Smoking was the other primary method. Hang meat high in the rafters where the constant smoke from the hearth would envelope it day and night for weeks. The compounds in wood smoke, things like formaldehyde and various phenols, prevented bacterial growth while simultaneously drying the meat and infusing it with flavour. Medieval people didn't understand the chemistry. They didn't know about phenols and formaldehyde. They didn't understand how smoke changed the pH of meat's surface or how it created an antibacterial coating. But they understood it worked. They understood that smoked meat lasted. That's all the understanding they needed. By midday, the village thrummed with activity. Blood and smoke hung in the air. Families processed animals with industrial efficiency. Blood became puddings, intestines became sausage casings. Fat was rendered for cooking and lighting. Bones would flavour soups for weeks. Nothing wasted. Nothing. The community aspect showed most clearly in these moments. Families helped each other with labour-intensive tasks. The village's 2 elderly widowed sisters couldn't manage slaughtering alone. Neighbours included their pig in the day's work. In return, the sisters would spin wool through winter for those who helped. Medieval social security. As the November day waned, Thomas returned home, blood spattered, hands raw from cold work, but satisfied. "We'll have enough," he told Emma quietly, so the children wouldn't hear the relief in his voice. That evening, darkness fell by mid-afternoon, the sun disappearing below the horizon well before 3 o'clock. This was one of the hardest adjustments of winter, the way daylight became a precious, fleeting resource. In summer, you could work in the fields until 8 or 9 in the evening, squeezing every possible moment of productivity from the long days. But winter gave you perhaps 7 hours of dim, weak daylight at best, and even that was often obscured by clouds and snow. The family gathered around the central hearth for a rare feast. Fresh meat, a luxury they hadn't enjoyed since the last feast day months ago. The parts that couldn't be preserved, the organs and odds and ends that would spoil within a day, had to be eaten immediately. Emma had roasted the liver with onions and herbs, the smell filling the small house and making everyone's mouths water. There was a rich stew made from the heart and kidneys, simmered for hours until the meat was tender. Fresh bread, baked that very afternoon while the oven was hot from roasting. Butter, yellow and creamy from the cow's milk. Ale, the good ale, not the weak small beer they usually drank. They ate slowly, savouring every bite, making it last. This was the most food they'd seen at one time in weeks, and it would be weeks more before they ate like this again. You could see it in their faces, the way their expressions softened, the way the tension of constant low-level hunger temporarily released its grip. The fire cast dancing shadows on the walls, making the smoke-blackened beams seem to shift and move in the flickering light. William sat near the woodpile, carefully splitting small pieces of kindling for the morning fire. This was important work, often overlooked in our modern understanding of medieval life. You couldn't just wake up and throw a log on the fire. You had to carefully nurture it from embers to small flame to sustained burn, and that required kindling, lots of kindling. William split enough for 2 or 3 days, small pieces that would catch easily and burn hot enough to ignite larger fuel. "Tell us about the worst winter, Father." Agnes's voice cut through the comfortable silence, her eyes wide in the firelight with that peculiar mix of fear and fascination that children have for scary stories. "Please? Mother said you would." Thomas exchanged a long glance with Emma across the fire. The flames reflected in her eyes, turning them golden red. They both knew what Agnes was asking about. They both remembered. How could they forget? Some memories burn themselves into your mind so deeply that decades cannot dim them. The winter of 1315, the Great Famine. Thomas had been 8 years old. Emma had been 7. They hadn't known each other then, had lived in different villages a few miles apart, but they'd both lived through it. Both survived it. Both carried the scars, physical and psychological, that such an experience leaves. It had started with rain. Not winter rain, not even autumn rain, but summer rain. Rain in August when the grain should have been ripening golden in the fields, ready for harvest, Instead, rain fell, day after day, week after week. The fields turned to mud. The grain rotted where it stood, stalks collapsing under the weight of constant moisture. What didn't rot failed to ripen properly, the kernels small and underdeveloped. The harvest that year had been perhaps a quarter of what was needed, maybe a third in the most fortunate areas, and the rains continued. Into September, into October, turning the earth into a swamp, making it impossible to plough for winter wheat. The second harvest failed before it was even planted. The famine that followed wasn't local. It wasn't one bad harvest in one region. It spread across all of northern Europe, from the British Isles to Poland, from Scandinavia to the Alps. Millions died. Conservative estimates say 10% of the population. Some estimates go as high as 25%. A quarter of all people dead from starvation and the diseases that follow famine. 2 years. The Great Famine lasted 2 years before better weather returned and harvests recovered. 2 years of watching your neighbours waste away to skeletons. 2 years of burying children and elderly, and anyone whose body wasn't strong enough to survive on minimal nutrition. 2 years of eating things that weren't food, that wouldn't normally be considered food, just to fill your stomach with something, anything. Thomas remembered his father, a strong man who had worked in the fields his entire life, reduced to skin and bones. He remembered watching him grow weaker, day by day, as he gave most of his portion to his children, trying to keep them alive. He remembered his father dying in early spring of 1317, just as the worst of it was ending, his body simply too depleted to recover. He'd been 34 years old. He remembered his mother's eyes, hollow and sunken, her cheekbones standing out sharp under papery skin. She'd survived, but barely. She'd lost 3 of her 6 children that winter, 2 young ones and a baby. They'd simply stopped moving one day, their small bodies unable to continue. He remembered the taste of bread made from ground bark when the grain ran out entirely. Bark and acorns and anything that could be dried and ground into something resembling flour. It wasn't nutritious. It barely kept you alive. But it filled your belly, gave you the illusion of eating. He remembered eating grass, literally grazing like an animal, because there was nothing else. Remembered digging for roots in the frozen ground, finding them twisted and bitter, but eating them anyway. Remembered the desperation, the constant gnawing hunger that was worse than any pain he'd ever experienced. But Agnes didn't need to hear that story, not in detail, not yet. She was too young. It would give her nightmares, and nightmares were dangerous in their own way. Children who couldn't sleep, who lay awake in fear, grew weak more quickly when hardship came. Better to tell of the winter your grandmother faced as a girl, Emma interjected smoothly, catching Thomas's eye and giving him a small nod. She understood. She always understood. When the Thames froze so solid they held a fair on the ice. Thomas nodded gratefully, shifting mental gears. This was a better story. Still true, still part of the family history, but without the horror that would haunt a 6-year-old's dreams. Right, he said, settling into the storyteller's rhythm that came naturally after years of passing down family history. The winter of 1309. Your great-grandmother was just a girl then, living in London with her father who was a cordwainer, a shoemaker. She told me this story many times when I was a boy. The children leaned in, even Margaret and William, who'd heard this story before. Good stories bore repeating in medieval culture, and this was a good story. That winter was so cold that the Thames itself, that great river running through the heart of London, froze solid. Not just a skin of ice that would break if you stepped on it, but solid ice thick enough to walk on, thick enough to build fires on, thick enough to hold hundreds of people at once. Agnes's eyes went even wider. Fires on the ice? Fires on the ice, Thomas confirmed. Merchants set up stalls right there on the frozen river, as if it were a regular market day. They roasted meats over braziers and open fires. The ice was so thick, so solid, that the fires didn't melt through. Your great-grandmother said you could smell the roasting meat for miles, and people came from all over to see the frost fair. What else? Agnes asked, completely absorbed now. What else happened on the ice? There were games and contests, races across the ice to see who was fastest, wrestling matches, archery competitions, musicians and jugglers and performers of all kinds, because people would pay to be entertained, and everyone wanted to be part of something so unusual. Your great-grandmother said there was a man who did acrobatics, flipping and tumbling on the ice like it was a stage. Did she go on the ice? Margaret asked. Even at 14, even trying to appear sophisticated and above such childish stories, she was interested. She did, Thomas said. Her father took her, and she said it was like walking on a solid road, not slippery at all because the ice was too thick and too rough. She said people were riding horses from one bank to the other, crossing the river on ice instead of bridges. There were even ox carts on the ice, carrying goods like it was any normal road. How long did it last? William wanted to know. He was practical, always wanting to understand the mechanics of things. Weeks, Thomas said. Nearly 2 months, she said, before the thaw came and the ice broke up. The frost fair had to pack up quickly when the weather turned, because once ice starts to melt it goes fast. She said they heard stories of a few unlucky souls who waited too long and fell through when the ice gave way. But most people were wise enough to leave when they saw the weather changing. The story wound down, and the family sat quietly, staring into the fire, each lost in their own thoughts. Outside, the wind picked up, whistling through gaps in the walls, reminding them that winter was here, now, real and present and dangerous. Time to bank the fire for the night, Thomas said eventually, rising from his seat with a grunt. His joints had stiffened while sitting, and the cold that had been kept at bay by the fire immediately pressed in closer. Banking the fire was an art form in itself. You couldn't let it go out entirely because starting fire from scratch was difficult and time-consuming. Medieval people had flint and steel for fire starting, but it took skill and patience and often many attempts. Much easier to maintain embers overnight and revive them in the morning. Thomas arranged the logs carefully, positioning them so they would burn slowly through the night, collapsing inward as they consumed themselves, the coals settling into a bed of red heat that would last until dawn. He added a layer of ash over the top, partially smothering the coals, slowing their burn even further. Done properly, you'd wake to glowing embers that could be coaxed back to flame with kindling and patient blowing. The family prepared for bed with practiced routine, movements that had become second nature over years of winter survival. Agnes took the smooth river stones that had been heating near the fire all evening, carefully wrapping each one in layers of rag to prevent burns. These would go at the foot of the bedding, providing warmth that would last for hours. The stones would be cold by morning, but by then morning would have arrived and the fire would be revived. Extra clothing was layered over sleeping garments. You didn't undress for bed in winter. You added more clothes, tunics and shawls and leggings and whatever else would help retain body heat. The bed itself was piled with every scrap of fabric the family owned. Woolen blankets, scratchy but warm. Old clothing too worn to wear but still useful for bedding. Furs from rabbits and squirrels, small pelts stitched together into larger coverings. The shutters were checked one final time, ensuring they were secure against the wind. A loose shutter could let in drafts that would drop the interior temperature dangerously low overnight. Thomas took a final look around their small home, making a mental inventory. Meat hung from the rafters, the smoked and salted pieces that would sustain them through winter. 4 hams, their surfaces dark and dry. Strings of sausages, a side of bacon. The carefully stored vegetables were safe in their cool corner, turnips and parsnips and carrots layered with straw. The woodpile was stacked nearly to the ceiling on one side of the room, enough fuel to last another few weeks if they were careful. They were ready as they could be. This was the eternal question of medieval winter. Were you ready? Had you prepared enough? Would your supplies last? Would your house stay warm enough? Would everyone stay healthy? So many variables, so many things that could go wrong, and all you could do was prepare as best you knew how and hope it would be enough. Outside, wind picked up. Through cracks in the door, snowflakes began to swirl in the darkness. Time to bank the fire for the night, Thomas said, arranging logs to keep embers alive until morning. Starting fire from scratch was difficult and time-consuming. Maintaining one was exponentially easier. The family prepared for bed with practiced routine. Agnes placed hot stones warmed by the fire wrapped in rags at the foot of the bedding, extra clothing layered over sleeping garments, shutters checked for security against wind. Thomas took a final look around their small home. Meat hung from rafters, vegetables safe in their cool corner, wood piled nearly to the ceiling. They were ready as they could be. Outside, snow fell faster, blanketing the village in white. Medieval winters were extremes, biting cold and cozy hearths, community cooperation and isolated hardship, potential starvation and careful preparation. For the Fletcher family, the next few months would test every skill, every resource, every bit of resilience they possessed. The snow continued falling through the night. By morning the world had transformed, white and grey landscape. Thomas woke before dawn as always, immediately feeling sharp cold against his face. The fire had burned down to faint embers. Moving quietly, he slipped from beneath covers and padded across the floor. Chill seeped through his woolen socks, a reminder of seasonal dangers. He knelt by the hearth and began the daily ritual. Reviving fire, perhaps the most crucial skill of winter survival. A handful of dry straw to the embers, gentle blowing. The straw caught, small twigs added, then larger kindling. Within minutes a small flame danced. Only then did he add a proper log, positioning it carefully to maximize heat. The Fletcher home, like most peasant dwellings, was built with winter in mind. Simple by modern standards, but incorporating generations of wisdom about surviving cold. Single-room cottage, 20 feet by 15 feet. Small enough to heat with a single fire, large enough to house the family and some animals during the coldest months. Emma stirred as firelight grew stronger. "Is it snowing still?" Thomas nodded, peering through a crack in the shutters. "Nearly up to my knees. Wind's driving it against the south wall. Actually good news. Snow was excellent insulation. A good snowfall piled against house walls helped keep precious heat inside. Some villagers manually piled snow against their walls in harsh winters. The walls themselves, wattle and daub construction, created surprisingly effective insulation. Straw trapped air pockets. Clay provided thermal mass that absorbed heat during the day and released it slowly at night. As the fire grew stronger, the room began to warm. Warm being relative. The Fletchers would consider the room comfortable at what we'd find chilly, 50, 55 degrees Fahrenheit at best, often much cooler. William and Margaret woke next, immediately moving closer to the growing fire. Agnes remained curled under blankets. "We should check the roof," Thomas said to William. "That much snow could be heavy." The thatched roof was both advantage and liability in winter. Thick straw layers provided excellent insulation against cold and heat, but heavy snow could damage it if allowed to accumulate. Most medieval houses had steeply pitched roofs specifically to shed snow, but particularly heavy falls required attention. While the men prepared to clear the roof, Emma and Margaret began the morning meal. Winter breakfast was simple but hearty. Porridge made from oats or barley, perhaps flavoured with honey if they were fortunate. Medieval people didn't eat breakfast, lunch and dinner as we do. They typically ate 2 meals, lighter one in the morning, main meal in the afternoon. "Put on your leg wrappings before you go outside," Emma instructed William, pointing to the long strips of woolen cloth piled near the door. These weren't decorative, they were essential survival gear. Medieval winter clothing was all about layers, about trapping air, about understanding through generations of trial and error what worked and what didn't. Wool was the most crucial material, and it's worth understanding why. We tend to think of cotton as the default fabric, but cotton was rare and expensive in medieval Europe, imported from distant lands at great cost. And even if it had been common, it would have been a poor choice for winter survival. Cotton, when it gets wet, loses its insulating properties almost completely. Wet cotton pulls heat away from your body, can actually kill you faster than being naked in some conditions. But wool? Wool is different. Wool fibres are covered in microscopic scales and crimps that trap air even when wet. Wool can absorb up to 30% of its weight in moisture without feeling damp. Wool continues to insulate even in rain or snow. In the often wet winters of northern Europe, where freezing rain and sleet were as common as dry snow, this property of wool meant the difference between survival and hypothermia. So the Fletchers, like every peasant family, owned as much wool as they could manage. They kept sheep if they had access to common grazing land. They traded for wool if they didn't. Emma spent hours at the spinning wheel, transforming raw fleece into yarn. Margaret was learning to weave that yarn into cloth. Every scrap of woolen fabric was precious, mended and remended until it literally fell apart, then repurposed into smaller items, then finally used as stuffing or insulation. For working people, winter clothing was practical rather than fashionable. No one cared what you looked like. They cared whether you would survive the walk from your house to the barn. Men wore woolen tunics reaching to the knee or mid-thigh, sometimes longer. Underneath, a linen undershirt called a shirt or chemise. The linen layer worn next to the skin absorbed sweat and could be washed more easily than the woolen outer layers. Washing wool was tricky. Do it wrong and it would shrink or felt into uselessness. So the linen took the brunt of body oils and dirt, protecting the valuable wool. In winter, men added more layers, another tunic over the first, a heavier woolen over tunic or coat on top of that. Maybe a cloak if they owned one, though cloaks were expensive and not every peasant could afford them. The key was layers that trapped air between them, each layer adding to the total insulation. Legs were covered with loose-fitting trousers called brays, or with hose, which were individual leg coverings, not quite like modern stockings, but similar in concept. Over these, men often wound long strips of woolen cloth from ankle to knee. These leg wrappings, called winingas or leg bindings, served multiple purposes. They provided extra warmth. They protected the legs from scratches and scrapes. They kept snow from getting into your boots. They could be unwrapped and rewrapped to adjust for temperature, tighter when it was coldest, looser when you were doing heavy work and generating heat. Women's clothing followed similar principles. Long woolen gowns, called kirtles or gowns depending on quality and style, worn over linen chemises, multiple layers in winter, an undergown, an overgown, maybe a sideless surcoat on top, shawls and head coverings to prevent heat loss from the head, woolen stockings under the skirts. Both sexes wore caps or hoods to retain body heat. This was critical. Your head, despite being only about 10% of your body's surface area, can account for up to 45% of heat loss in cold conditions, more if the head is uncovered while the rest of the body is insulated. Medieval people didn't know the exact percentages, but they knew from experience that a covered head meant a warmer body. Mittens rather than gloves were standard. The reasoning was sound. Fingers sharing warmth in a single pouch stayed warmer than fingers isolated in individual tubes. You sacrificed dexterity for warmth, but in winter, warmth mattered more. Fine work was done indoors by the fire where you could remove the mittens temporarily. Footwear was one of the biggest challenges of medieval winter. Leather shoes, the standard footwear, offered little insulation. Leather conducted heat away from your feet almost as efficiently as bare ground. So thick woolen socks were absolutely essential, sometimes multiple pairs. Some people added insoles cut from felt or layered straw inside their shoes for additional insulation and to create an air gap between foot and ground. In deep snow, wealthier peasants might own wooden pattens, a type of overshoe that raised your foot an inch or two above the ground on a wooden platform. These kept your leather shoes out of the wet snow, preserving them and keeping your feet drier, but pattens were expensive, and not everyone could afford them. More commonly, people simply wrapped their feet in additional layers of cloth before putting on their shoes, or tied bags around their shoes to keep them dry. Despite all these adaptations, frostbite was common in medieval winters. Toes and fingers lost to the cold, noses and ears damaged, permanent injury from temporary exposure. The Fletcher family had been lucky so far, no serious frostbite injuries, but they knew people in the village who'd lost toes, who walked with a limp because of old cold injuries. "Be careful on the roof," Emma cautioned as Thomas and William prepared to climb the rough ladder leaning against the side of the house. "The storm's not finished yet, and the ice makes everything slippery." Her voice carried the particular tone of a woman who'd seen too many accidents, too many men who'd fallen from roofs or ladders and broken bones or worse. In winter, a broken leg could mean death. You couldn't work. You couldn't help with chores. You became a burden on the family at the time when the family could least afford it. Broken bones often didn't set properly without medical care that peasants couldn't access, leaving you crippled for life. Thomas nodded acknowledgement, understanding her concern even if he didn't voice it. He secured his footing carefully before climbing, testing each rung of the ladder for ice or weakness. Indeed, snow still fell, though less heavily than during the night. The worst of the storm had passed, but light flakes continued to drift down from a sky the colour of old pewter. The temperature had risen slightly with daylight, a few degrees above where it had been at dawn, but it remained well below freezing. Thomas's breath formed thick clouds in the air. His fingers, even wrapped in woolen mittens, were already growing numb. The village was eerily quiet, muffled by the snow. Most people were choosing to remain indoors unless absolutely necessary. No unnecessary trips, no social visits, just survival, hunkered down, waiting for the weather to improve. From the roof, Thomas and William could see the entire village laid out below them like a miniature model. Smoke rose from each house, creating grey columns against the pale sky. You could count the houses by counting the smoke plumes. 12 dwellings in total, plus the manor house. 12 families, roughly 80 people altogether, give or take. Small by modern standards, but typical for a medieval English village. Near the manor house, which stood apart from the peasant dwellings on a slight rise, servants were already out clearing paths. Thomas could see 3 figures, small in the distance, shoveling snow from the walkway to the barn, from the barn to the main house. The Lord would expect his household to function normally regardless of weather. Servants couldn't afford to stay indoors and wait out a storm. The manor house itself represented a completely different approach to winter survival, one based on wealth rather than ingenuity. It was built of stone rather than wattle and daub, massive blocks of limestone quarried miles away and brought in at enormous expense. Stone construction was both more durable and ironically often colder than peasant cottages. Stone has high thermal mass, meaning it holds temperature well, but it also conducts heat away from warm spaces very efficiently. A stone building in winter acts like a massive heat sink, constantly pulling warmth out of the air. However, the Lord's house had advantages unavailable to peasants. Multiple fireplaces, 3 or 4 at least, maybe more in a large manor. Each major room had its own fireplace with a proper chimney, meaning the smoke vented outside instead of filling the interior. The Lord could afford to burn prodigious quantities of wood, keeping multiple fires blazing simultaneously. He could afford to burn coal, which produced even more heat than wood. He could afford candles made from beeswax instead of tallow, providing better light for longer periods. Glazed windows admitted light while blocking wind. Window glass was expensive, incredibly expensive, but it transformed the winter experience. Peasants had to choose between light and warmth, keeping shutters open to see or closed to stay warm. The Lord had both simultaneously. Light flooded his rooms even with the windows closed, and the glass kept out the worst of the drafts. Tapestries hung on the walls added insulation and beauty. These weren't just decorative. Thick woven hangings created an air gap between the cold stone and the interior space, reducing heat loss. They also served as movable walls, allowing rooms to be subdivided, creating smaller spaces that were easier to heat. For the Lord's family, winter comfort came through luxury adaptations that peasants couldn't imagine. Finer furs, imports from far north where the winter was even harsher and the fur even thicker, bearskins and ermine and mink, bedding filled with down instead of straw, better food, more varied diet, more protein and fat to help the body generate heat internally, servants to maintain fires constantly, to prepare hot meals multiple times a day, to heat bricks that would be wrapped and placed in the bed to warm the sheets. Yet even the nobility felt winter's bite. Castle life in January could be absolutely miserable. The great halls were impossible to heat properly, too large, too high-ceilinged, too drafty. People would cluster around fireplaces at one end while the other end of the room remained near freezing. Bedchambers, located in towers for defensive reasons, were often the coldest rooms of all. Wind whistled through arrow slits and around window frames. Ice sometimes formed in water basins overnight, even in the Lord's own chambers. Noblewomen complained bitterly in their letters about the cold, about chilblains and chapped skin and the constant discomfort. The difference was that nobility had resources to mitigate the worst of it, while peasants simply endured. The Fletchers, like most peasants, had adapted their living space for maximum winter efficiency. The house was oriented with the smaller end facing prevailing winter wind, minimizing surface exposed to elements. The door was on the lee side, protected from direct wind. Inside, the central hearth was positioned to heat the entire space as evenly as possible. By mid-morning, immediate chores were complete. Roof cleared, more firewood brought in from the covered stack outside. Breakfast finished. Now came the challenge that defined winter days: how to stay warm while conserving precious fuel. "Agnes, bring your spinning to the fire," Emma instructed. "Margaret will work on the weaving." Winter was the season of indoor work, particularly textiles. While men might brave cold for essential tasks like caring for livestock or repairing tools, women and children often spent short days spinning, weaving, and sewing. These tasks could be done in dim winter light and close to the hearth. "The cow needs milking," Thomas reminded William. Though they'd slaughtered some animals before winter, the family kept one milk cow in the byre, the attached shelter that housed livestock. During particularly cold spells, the cow might even be brought into the main room. This practice of sharing living space with animals wasn't simply affection for livestock. Animals generated considerable body heat. Having them indoors was a practical way to stay warmer. A cow could raise ambient temperature of a small house by several degrees. The chickens in their corner coop added their modest heat as well. "The snow's good for something, at least," William observed as he returned with a small pail of milk. "The byre feels warmer with the drifts against it." Thomas nodded. "Check for any gaps where wind gets in. Pack them with straw if you find any." Drafts were the enemy of winter warmth, the invisible assassin that could steal heat faster than you could generate it. Medieval homes lacked window glass, that luxury being reserved for churches and the homes of the very wealthy. Instead, windows were covered with wooden shutters that could be closed against the cold, or with oiled parchment that admitted some dim light while blocking some wind, or with stretched animal skins that served a similar purpose. These were all imperfect barriers. Cold air inevitably found its way inside through cracks and gaps. The wood of shutters warped and shrank with weather changes, creating spaces where wind could penetrate. Parchment and skin deteriorated over time, developing tiny holes that let in drafts. Vigilance in finding and sealing these gaps was a constant winter chore, stuffing cracks with rags or straw, checking and rechecking, because a single draft could make a room unbearable. As noon approached, though noon was determined more by the quality of light than any clock, none of which existed in peasant households, Emma began preparing the main meal of the day. This was a production that would take hours, not because medieval people were slow or inefficient, but because the food required extensive preparation and long cooking to become palatable. She moved to the pot hanging over the fire, an iron cauldron suspended from a hook that could be raised or lowered to control cooking temperature. This pot was one of the family's most valuable possessions, worth more than months of labour. It would last for generations if cared for properly, passed down from mother to daughter as both tool and heirloom. Winter meals centred around what had been preserved, and what had been preserved centred around what would keep longest with available technology. Dried beans and peas, hard as stones when stored but softening with hours of cooking. Salted meat that had to be rinsed or soaked to remove some of the overwhelming saltiness before use. Root vegetables from the storage pit that were often starting to sprout or soften but were still edible. Grains that could be ground into flour or boiled into porridge. Today's pottage, the thick soup stew that was the staple of medieval peasant diet, would contain dried peas that had been soaking since the previous evening, swelling with absorbed water. A small piece of salted pork, perhaps the size of your palm, that would flavour the entire pot even though it would be divided among 5 people. Onions from the storage pit, their outer layers peeling away but their cores still firm and pungent. Turnips, also from the storage pit, their white flesh may be a bit spongy but still nutritious. A handful of barley for additional bulk and nutrition. Emma added these ingredients methodically, in the right order for optimal cooking. The peas went in first, needing the longest cooking time to become tender. The salted pork next, its fat rendering out to enrich the broth. The barley after that. The onions and turnips would go in later, closer to serving time, so they wouldn't cook to complete mush. Seasoning came from herbs dried and hung from the rafters months ago. A few leaves of sage crumbled between her fingers, releasing their pungent aroma. Some thyme, still holding its flavour despite months of storage. A precious pinch of pepper from their tiny store. The exotic spice that had come all the way from the Indies through Venice, changing hands dozens of times, each trader adding their markup until it cost more than gold by weight. But even a tiny amount transformed the taste of food, made it seem less monotonous, less like pure subsistence. The storage pit, mentioned so casually, represented sophisticated understanding of food preservation through temperature control. It was a hole dug into the earth, typically 3 or 4 feet deep, sometimes partially lined with stones or wood to prevent collapse. The pit was accessed through a wooden lid flush with the ground or slightly raised. Inside, straw provided insulation and cushioning, creating a microclimate that stayed just above freezing even when the air temperature dropped well below. This was the perfect temperature for storing root vegetables, cold enough to slow decay and prevent sprouting, warm enough that the vegetables wouldn't freeze solid and turn to mush when they thawed. Medieval people understood this through generations of trial and error. Even if they couldn't explain the microbiology of bacterial growth or the physics of heat transfer, different vegetables were stored using different methods based on their particular needs. Cabbages with their outer leaves left on for protection, layered with straw. Carrots and parsnips buried in sand or loose soil to prevent them from drying out. Turnips and beets simply piled with straw between the layers. Apples wrapped individually and placed where air could circulate around them. Some vegetables were preserved through pickling or fermentation instead of cold storage. Cabbage became sauerkraut, shredded and salted and allowed to ferment in wooden barrels, the beneficial bacteria preventing harmful bacteria from establishing themselves. Cucumbers from summer became pickles in vinegar brine. These fermented and pickled vegetables provided crucial vitamins during winter, helping prevent scurvy and other deficiency diseases, while the pottage simmered, filling the small house with savoury aroma that made everyone's mouth water, despite having eaten this same meal dozens of times already this winter. Thomas worked on repairing a wooden harrow, but the uncertain light of the fire. A harrow was a farm implement dragged behind an ox to break up soil after ploughing, essential for proper planting. This one had suffered damage last season, several wooden teeth broken off, the frame cracked. Repairing it now, during the forced idleness of winter, meant it would be ready when spring planting time arrived. There would be no time for repairs then. Every daylight hour would be devoted to getting crops in the ground during the narrow window, when soil was workable but not yet too dry. Tools had to be ready, had to work perfectly, because any delay in planting could mean the difference between adequate harvest and starvation the following winter. "The wind's picking up again," Margaret noted, pausing in her weaving to listen to the howl around the eaves, the whistle of air forcing its way through gaps and cracks in the walls and roof. Thomas glanced at the fire, doing rapid calculations in his head. They'd burned through more wood than planned today. The extreme cold demanded it. But the woodpile was visibly smaller than it had been even a week ago, and they still had months of winter ahead. This was the constant balance of winter survival. Use enough fuel to stay safely warm, but not so much that you run out before spring. Except, how much is enough? How much is too much? The variables were endless. How cold would it get? How long would the extreme cold last? Would there be a warming spell that let you conserve fuel? Or would it stay bitter until March? You made your best guess based on experience and intuition, and you hoped you were right. Because being wrong meant either freezing or running out of fuel with winter still raging, both of which could be fatal. They were using wood faster than he'd like on such a cold day, but there was no help for it, no real choice. Without adequate heat, they risked not just discomfort, but genuine danger. Hypothermia could kill even indoors if the temperature dropped low enough. Every winter, every village lost at least one elderly person to cold, found frozen in their own home when neighbours came to check on them. "We'll move the bedding closer to the hearth tonight," Thomas decided. "Everyone will sleep in their main room." On the coldest nights, the family would abandon their usual sleeping arrangements and create pallets directly around the fire, forming a circle with the hearth at the centre. They'd take turns throughout the night adding fuel, making sure the fire never died completely. Maintaining heat until dawn brought some relief. By early afternoon, though the weak winter sun was already starting its descent toward the horizon, the main meal was ready. The pottage had been simmering for hours. The peas had softened to creamy tenderness. The flavours had melded into a rich, savoury whole. It wasn't fancy food, it wasn't varied or exciting, but it was hot and filling and nutritious, and that was enough. That was everything. The family gathered around the fire to eat directly from wooden bowls, spoons carved from horn or wood. Wealthy families had individual trenchers, thick slabs of stale bread that served as edible plates. Wealthier still had pewter dishes, but the Fletchers, like most peasants, ate from bowls that had been in the family for generations, repaired when they cracked, used until they literally fell apart. Everyone savoured the warmth of the food as much as its flavour. Hot food in winter wasn't just nutrition, it was heat that went inside you, warming you from within in a way external heat never could. You could feel it spreading through your body, could feel your core temperature rising, could feel your fingers and toes beginning to tingle as circulation improved. Mealtimes were bright spots in winter days, islands of relative comfort in a sea of cold and hardship, a pause in the constant effort to stay warm, to stay alive, a moment when the family could be together, could share not just food but companionship, conversation, connection. "Tell us more about the frost fair, Father," Agnes requested between careful spoonfuls of the hot pottage. What else happened on the ice? Between his own spoonfuls, Thomas smiled. He was always ready to share stories that made winter seem magical rather than merely threatening, that helped his children see beauty and wonder rather than only danger and discomfort. Well, they say that in the great frost of 1309, the Thames froze so hard that people walked across it as easily as crossing a road. The ice was so thick, feet thick in places, that it could support enormous weight. Merchants didn't just set up simple booths on the ice. They built entire shops, wooden structures with roofs and walls, as if the frozen river were solid ground. His children listened, captivated. Even though they'd heard variations of this story many times, they sold hot wine and roasted meats, and your great-grandmother said the smell of cooking food spread for miles. There were games and races, people competing to see who could slide furthest on the ice. Musicians played while people danced, their feet pounding on the ice, making it boom like a drum. Jugglers and acrobats entertained crowds who'd come from all over London to witness the spectacle. What Thomas didn't mention, what he deliberately left out for the sake of the children, was that such extreme freezes also brought extreme hardship. During those same frost fairs, many people died from exposure, from falling through weak patches in the ice, from hunger because the frozen river halted all boat traffic and trade. The stories emphasized wonder and minimized horror, because that was what children needed. They'd learn the full truth soon enough as they grew older. Did anyone fall through? William wanted to know, his practical mind immediately identifying the danger in the story. A few, Thomas admitted, because you couldn't lie to children entirely. They needed to understand that danger was real. But most people were careful. They tested the ice before walking on it, listened for cracking sounds, avoided areas where the ice looked thin or dark, and most people survived, and they had stories to tell for the rest of their lives about the winter the Thames froze solid. Stories of winter's wonders helped balance the reality of its dangers, helped people frame their experience in terms that included beauty and amazement, rather than only fear and suffering. This was a crucial psychological adaptation that made winter survivable not just physically, but mentally. After the meal, the family returned to their tasks, staying close to the fire as daylight began to fade. All too early in December, winter days were brutally short with darkness falling by mid-afternoon. This limited productive time and extended the dangerous cold of night. "We should check on Widow Thatcher," Emma said as she put aside her weaving. She was coughing badly at the slaughtering yesterday. Community was crucial to winter survival. Neighbours checked on one another, particularly the elderly or those living alone. A simple cold could become deadly during winter. Someone unable to maintain their fire might freeze without intervention. While Emma wrapped herself in an extra layer to visit the neighbouring cottage, Thomas prepared the house for evening. He moved livestock feed closer to the door to minimise trips outside. He checked their water barrel, now containing melted snow rather than well water, as the path to the village well was treacherous with ice. The house had no candles to spare. These expensive items were saved for emergencies or special occasions. Instead, a simple rushlight provided illumination after dark. This primitive lamp was made by soaking a reed in animal fat and then lighting it. It gave poor light by modern standards, but was sufficient for limited winter evening activities. As darkness fell fully, Emma returned from her neighbourly visit. She's better today. Her grandson has come to stay with her until the snow melts. The family gathered close to the fire for the evening hours. This was a time for talking, for sharing knowledge, for strengthening bonds that helped them survive. Thomas taught William how to carve a new handle for a tool, their heads bent together over the work. Emma showed the girls a new stitch for darning worn socks. The fire crackled, casting dancing shadows on walls. Outside, wind continued to blow, driving new snow against the house. But inside, the Fletcher family had created a pocket of warmth and life amid winter's harshness. This was the rhythm of medieval winter, a constant balance between conservation and necessity, between danger of elements and warmth of human ingenuity and community. Their house, humble as it was, represented centuries of adaptation to the season's challenges. As they prepared for bed, Banking the fire carefully to preserve embers for morning, Thomas glanced around the single room that was their entire world during winter. It wasn't much by any standard, yet it stood between them and the killing cold outside. Their ancestors had learned through bitter trial and error how to create these shelters, how to insulate them, how to maximize the precious heat of fire. The snow continued to fall through the darkness, piling deeper against the walls. Within their simple home, the Fletcher family slept, warmed by fire, by wool, by shared body heat, and by the accumulated wisdom of generations who had faced and survived the medieval winter before them. The following days established a pattern. Wake before dawn, revive the fire, eat simple meals, work on essential tasks, conserve fuel, maintain community connections, sleep close to the hearth. A week after the first heavy snowfall, the church bell rang, calling the village to Sunday Mass. Despite the cold, attendance wasn't optional. Both religious obligation and community need drew people from warm hearths to the stone church at the village centre. Wear your best tunics, Emma instructed as the family prepared to leave, and mind the ice on the path. Church was more than religious observance. It was the centre of medieval social life, especially in winter when fieldwork ceased. The stone building was perpetually cold, but gathering bodies provided warmth, and shared experience offered comfort of a different kind. The Fletchers joined other families making their way through snow. Everyone wore their finest clothes, though finest was relative. Perhaps a tunic with minimal patches or a head covering with simple embroidery. Winter church attendance wasn't just about piety. It was rare opportunity to see neighbours, exchange news, and maintain community bonds essential for survival. Inside, the church was cold, but candles flickered on the altar, and familiar Latin words of the Mass created a sense of continuity and stability. Most villagers understood little of the Latin service, but they knew when to kneel, when to stand, when to make the sign of the cross. Father Stephen, the village priest, looked gaunt as he conducted the service. Winter was difficult for him too. His small cottage beside the church had only a modest hearth, and as a single man he lacked the family support network that helped others survive the cold months. After Mass ended, villagers lingered, reluctant to return immediately to isolated homes. This was the true purpose of Sunday gathering in winter. The chance to connect, to share information, to reaffirm community. "Any word from the manor about work?" Thomas asked John Cooper, who sometimes served as messenger between the village and the Lord's estate. "Nothing yet," John replied, "though they're saying the Lord will need men to clear fallen trees once the snow melts." Such information was valuable. Winter work was scarce but essential for families whose food stores might not last until spring. Clearing fallen timber, repairing roads, or helping with construction at the manor provided rare opportunities to earn food or coin during lean months. The women gathered in their own circles, exchanging different but equally vital information. "Our youngest has a cough that won't quit," said Alice Miller, her face lined with worry. "Nothing seems to help." "Try honey and ground pine needles steeped in hot water," Emma suggested. It helped Agnes last winter. Medical knowledge passed this way, woman to woman, tested through generations of trial and error. With no doctors available to peasants, these folk remedies represented the best hope for treating winter ailments. Children played in the churchyard despite the cold, throwing snowballs, sliding on ice. These moments of freedom from confines of small smoky houses were precious, allowing pent-up energy to be released. As the gathering broke up, Father Stephen approached Thomas. "Will you and William join us tonight? I've been teaching young Henry to play chess, and we could use more players." Thomas nodded, pleased at the invitation. We'll come after the evening meal. This was another aspect of winter community. Small gatherings in different homes or at the church, providing entertainment and companionship during long dark evenings. Back at their cottage, Emma prepared the midday meal while Thomas added precious fuel to the fire. The church visit had chilled them. They needed to restore warmth to both bodies and home. "Can we go to Widow Thatcher's tonight for stories?" Agnes asked as they ate. "If the weather holds," Emma agreed, "and if you finish your spinning first." Evening gatherings served multiple purposes in medieval winter. They allowed several families to share a single fire, conserving precious fuel. They provided entertainment when no other diversions were available. Most importantly, they maintained the social fabric of the village, strengthening bonds that might be called upon in times of need. As promised, Thomas and William headed to the priest's cottage after their evening meal, wrapped in extra layers against bitter night air. The snow squeaked beneath their feet, a sign of extreme cold. Above, stars glittered in a clear sky. Beautiful, but foreboding. Clear winter nights were always the coldest. Father Stephen's cottage was modest, but contained luxuries unavailable to most villagers. A few precious books, a real glass window, though tiny, and a chess set carved from wood. The pieces were simple but recognizable, worn smooth from years of handling. "Welcome, welcome," the priest greeted them, ushering them toward the fire. "Henry's already here, eager to show his new skills." Henry, the blacksmith's son, was 16 and uncommonly bright. The priest had taken an interest in him, teaching him to read simple Latin and to play chess, a game usually reserved for nobles and clergy. The chessboard was set up on a small table near the hearth, the pieces arranged in their starting positions. The board itself was simple, just a piece of wood with squares carved and stained alternately light and dark. The pieces were hand-carved from oak, each one unique, showing the wear of countless games over countless years. The rules they played by were somewhat different from modern chess, variations that had evolved in this particular region, passed down from player to player. The queen wasn't as powerful as in modern chess, limited in her movements, a reflection perhaps of medieval attitudes toward women's power. The bishop moved differently, combining features of what we'd recognize as bishop and knight. There was no castling, no en passant capture. But the basic concepts remained similar. Strategy, foresight, planning several moves ahead, protecting your pieces while threatening your opponents, thinking not just about immediate advantage but long-term positioning. These were the same skills, the same mental habits that helped communities survive winter. The ability to think ahead, to plan for contingencies, to balance risk and reward, to make the best of limited resources. Chess was entertainment, certainly, but it was also practical education in the kind of thinking that kept you alive. "The bishop moves only on diagonals," Father Stephen reminded William, who played less frequently than the others and sometimes forgot the rules. The priest's patience was infinite when it came to teaching. "Like this, see? 3 squares diagonally, and now my bishop threatens your knight." William studied the board carefully. His young face creased in concentration. You could see him thinking through possibilities, considering and rejecting different moves. Finally, he moved his own knight away from the threatened square. Not the strongest move, perhaps, but a safe one. The men and boys played for several hours, the fire crackling beside them, shadows dancing on the walls. The competition was friendly but intense. No money changed hands. There was no coin to spare for gambling, but pride was at stake, and the satisfaction of victory or the sting of defeat. Chess was more than a game. It was an escape from the monotony of winter, from the constant background anxiety about food and fuel and survival. For a few hours, the players could forget about depleting stores and approaching scarcity, and instead focus on this small battlefield of wood and imagination. It was a chance to exercise minds that might otherwise dwell too much on cold and hunger, to engage in intellectual activity that had nothing to do with survival and everything to do with being human, with finding meaning and challenge and satisfaction beyond mere subsistence. Father Stephen, as always, won most of his games. He'd been playing chess since boyhood, had learned from a travelling monk who'd stopped at the village church years ago. But Henry was improving rapidly, his natural intelligence and competitive spirit driving him to study the game, to remember patterns, to develop his own strategies. Tonight he actually managed to win one game, and his grin of triumph lit up the whole cottage. "Well played, my boy," Father Stephen said generously, reaching across the board to shake Henry's hand. "You saw that fork 3 moves ahead, didn't you? Excellent foresight." The praise made Henry glow even brighter. Opportunities for intellectual achievement were rare for peasant boys. Most would spend their lives in physical labour with little chance to develop their minds. But Father Stephen, to his credit, recognised intelligence wherever he found it and nurtured it when he could. Meanwhile, across the village, Emma and the girls were experiencing a different form of medieval entertainment, but one equally important for community cohesion and psychological survival. Widow Thatcher's cottage was packed with women and children, bodies pressed close together, sharing warmth and companionship. The widow's home was small, perhaps even smaller than the Fletchers', but she'd done a good job maintaining it. The walls had been recently replastered with fresh daub to seal any cracks. The thatched roof was intact, not leaking. The fire burned hot and steady in the central hearth. Come in," the old woman greeted each arrival, her voice quavering with age but her eyes still bright. Despite being in her 60s, despite the recent illness that had left her weak and coughing, she loved these gatherings. They gave her purpose, made her feel valued. In a society where the elderly could easily become burdens, the role of storyteller and tradition keeper provided worth and status. "We're just about to start," she announced when everyone had settled. The cottage was crowded but cosy, bodies pressed together on benches and stools and cushions made from straw-stuffed sacking. The air was thick with the smell of unwashed bodies, wood smoke, tallow from the rushlights. But no one minded. This was normal. This was what gatherings smelled like. Most of the women had brought handwork. Spinning spindles twirled, converting raw wool into thread with movements so practiced they required no conscious thought. Needles flashed in the firelight, mending worn clothing, darning socks, embroidering small decorations on special garments. The practical work never ceased, even during leisure time. This was the medieval reality. Entertainment happened while working, not instead of working. "Tell us about the fairy rings," one of the younger children requested. A girl of perhaps 5 or 6, her eyes already wide with anticipation. The widow smiled, a knowing grandmotherly smile that creased her weathered face into a map of wrinkles. She settled more comfortably on her stool, arranging her skirts, taking a breath to centre herself. She was slipping into role now, becoming the storyteller, taking on the responsibility of preserving and transmitting the community's folklore. "Well now," she began, her voice taking on a particular rhythm, a storyteller's cadence that signalled to everyone that the tale had begun. "You all know the green circles that appear in the meadows in summer, perfect rings of darker grass, bright green, growing in circles so precise they might have been drawn with a compass. They say those are where the fairies dance on Midsummer's Eve, round and round until they wear the grass into rings. The children leaned forward, captivated. Even the adults stopped their handwork temporarily, drawn into the familiar story. Good stories bore infinite retelling in medieval culture, and this was a story everyone had heard before, but that was part of its power. The familiar was comforting, the known was safe. But in winter, the widow continued, lowering her voice slightly, making everyone strain to hear, those same fairies go underground, down beneath the frozen earth, into their halls of crystal and gold, lit by lights that never go out, and they continue their dancing down there, spinning and whirling to music that humans can barely comprehend. She paused for effect, looking around the cottage at her rapt audience. And if you listen carefully on the stillest nights, when the snow has fallen thick and there's no wind, when the whole world seems to hold its breath, you can hear their music beneath the snow, faint, like bells made of ice, like harps strung with spider silk, beautiful beyond imagining. The children's eyes had gone wide, imagining this magical world beneath the frozen landscape. The adults smiled too, not necessarily because they believed the tale literally, some did and some didn't, but because stories brought colour and wonder to the monochrome winter world. Because fairy stories reminded them that there was more to life than survival, that beauty and magic existed even if only in imagination. But, and here the widow's voice dropped to almost a whisper, making the children lean in so close they were practically in her lap, you must never, ever follow that music. Because if you do, if you dig down through the snow, if you find the entrance to the fairy halls, if you go inside, you'll be enchanted. The fairies will welcome you. They'll give you food and wine. They'll invite you to dance, and you'll dance for what seems like one night. She paused again, letting the tension build. But when you finally leave, when you climb back up to the human world, you'll find that hundreds of years have passed. Everyone you knew is dead and dust. The world has changed beyond recognition, and within days, sometimes within hours, you'll age all those years at once. You'll crumble into dust yourself, becoming nothing but bones and memory. There was a collective shiver around the room. Even though everyone had heard this story before, even though they knew it was coming, the ending still had power. So remember, the widow concluded, her voice returning to normal volume. Never follow fairy music in winter. Better to stay by your own hearth, with your own family in the world you know. The story ended, and for a moment there was silence. Then one of the women began another story, and then another, the tales flowing one into another like beads on a string. This was storytelling's crucial function in medieval society. In a world without books for common people, without written records of family histories, without any way to preserve information except human memory, stories served as encyclopedia, entertainment, moral instruction, history book, and cultural identity all rolled into one. Stories taught children how to behave, what values the community prized. Stories about clever peasants outwitting cruel lords taught that intelligence could triumph over power, giving hope to the powerless. Stories about generous neighbours being rewarded and selfish ones being punished reinforced the communal values that made village life possible. Stories about saints and miracles strengthened religious faith. Stories about ancestors and historical events preserved community memory. And in the depths of winter, when people were confined indoors for months, when the darkness and cold and monotony could drive you mad, Stories provided escape, variety, stimulation. They gave people something to think about besides their empty stomachs and dwindling wood piles. After several stories, the women shifted to songs, another crucial form of entertainment and cultural preservation. They sang work songs, the rhythmic chants that usually accompanied summer labour in the fields. These songs coordinated group effort, making it easier to work together harvesting grain or hauling water. But they also celebrated the work itself, found meaning and even joy in physical labour. Singing them in winter served as a promise and reminder that spring would come, that field work would resume, that this period of confinement was temporary. They sang love ballads, some sweet and some bawdy, handed down for generations. These songs told of knights and ladies, of forbidden romance, of love triumphant or love tragic. They provided vicarious emotional experience, allowed people to feel and express sentiments that might be dangerous or inappropriate in their actual lives. They sang religious hymns learned from church services, praising God and the saints, asking for protection and blessing. These songs reinforced faith, reminded listeners that they were part of something larger than themselves, that their suffering had meaning and purpose in God's plan. The music filled the small cottage, women's voices blending and separating, some strong and clear, others wavering with age or illness, but all contributing to the whole. Medieval songs were typically sung in unison rather than harmony, everyone on the same melody line, but the effect was still powerful. Music created unity, literally making many voices into one. The melodies were simple but memorable, designed to be easily learned and passed on through oral tradition. No written music for peasants, everything memorized and transmitted person to person, generation to generation. What survived was what people remembered and taught their children, which meant that the songs that endured were the ones that resonated most deeply, that touched something universal in human experience. Like stories, songs preserved community knowledge and values while providing entertainment during the long dark evenings. They marked time, celebrated seasons, commemorated events, expressed emotions. They made the unbearable bearable and the mundane meaningful. In both the priest's cottage and the widow's home, the gatherings continued until the fires burned low, and people's eyes began to droop with exhaustion. Then, reluctantly, visitors prepared to return to their own homes through the frigid night. The price of companionship was the dangerous journey home through temperatures that could kill. But people paid that price willingly, because the alternative, spending every winter evening isolated in your own home with only your immediate family for company, would be psychologically unbearable. Humans are social creatures. We need community, need variety, need stimulation beyond what a handful of family members can provide. Medieval people understood this instinctively, even if they couldn't articulate it in psychological terms. The evening gatherings weren't luxuries, they were necessities, crucial for maintaining mental health through the long winter confinement. In both the priest's cottage and the widow's home, the gatherings continued until fires burned low. Then, reluctantly, visitors prepared to return to their own homes. The short journey through frigid night was the price paid for hours of companionship and entertainment. "Mind the path," Thomas cautioned William as they left the priest's cottage. "It's all ice now." The night had grown colder still, stars brilliant in the black sky. Their breath formed clouds in the freezing air. Snow crunched loudly underfoot. They walked quickly, eager to return to their own hearth. Emma and the girls were already home when they arrived. the cottage seeming especially dark and cold after the animated gatherings they'd all enjoyed. Thomas quickly revived the banked fire, adding fuel carefully measured to last until morning. "Did you win at chess?" Emma asked as they prepared for bed. "Father Stephen always wins," William replied with good-natured shrug. "But I lasted longer this time." "And the widow's stories?" Thomas asked his daughters. Agnes launched into enthusiastic retelling of the fairy ring tale, her eyes still wide with wonder. Margaret, at 14, pretended greater sophistication, but listened intently to her sister's narration. This sharing of experiences was itself a form of entertainment, extending the pleasure of evening gatherings. Each family member had different stories to tell, different songs they'd heard, different news they'd gathered. The following morning brought another dimension of medieval winter life. A travelling peddler arrived in the village, his pack laden with small goods from distant markets. Such visitors were rare in winter when roads were often impassable, making his arrival a significant event. Word spread quickly. Villagers gathered in the open area near the church to see what he offered. The peddler, a short man with a weather-beaten face, displayed his wares on a piece of cloth spread over the snow. Ribbons, needles, simple jewellery, spices, small tools. Few villagers had coin to spend, especially in winter when income opportunities were scarce. But the peddler accepted other forms of payment: eggs, cheese, small handicrafts that he could sell elsewhere. This barter system allowed even poor communities to access goods from beyond their immediate area. The peddler was valuable for more than just his wares. As he travelled between villages and towns, he gathered news and stories, becoming a human newspaper in a world without mass communication. "They say the river's frozen solid 10 miles north," he reported to the gathered villagers, "and food's growing scarce in the town. You're better off here with your own stores." Such information helped communities gauge their relative situations and prepare for challenges that might be heading their way. If famine or disease was reported in nearby areas, villages could limit travel or ration supplies more carefully. The peddler also brought songs and stories from other regions, introducing new elements to the local repertoire. That evening, the regular gatherings buzzed with fresh tales he'd shared, some believable, others clearly embellished, but all providing welcome novelty in the winter routine. 2 days later, the village experienced another form of winter celebration. January 6th marked Epiphany, the celebration of the Magi's visit to the infant Jesus. This important church feast provided a break in winter monotony and a chance for structured communal celebration. The day began with a special Mass. The church decorated with evergreen boughs, symbols of life persisting through winter. After the service, the village held a modest feast in the churchyard. Each family contributed what they could: a loaf of bread, a small piece of cheese, some preserved fruit or meat. By modern standards, it was a humble meal. But in the context of winter scarcity, the shared feast represented abundance and generosity. Children received special treats, perhaps a bite of honey cake or a small sweetmeat saved specifically for this occasion. The Epiphany celebration included selection of a bean king, a tradition in which a bean was hidden in a special cake, and whoever found it in their portion became king for the day. This year the honour fell to 12-year-old Peter, the miller's son, who received a paper crown and the right to make playful royal commands to other villagers. Such reversals of normal social order were common in medieval festivals, providing an outlet for tensions that built up in hierarchical societies. For one day, a child could playfully command adults, creating laughter and lightening the winter mood. The celebration included simple games, Sack races on packed snow, contests to see who could slide furthest on ice, blindfolded games where players tried to hit a suspended pot with a stick. The prizes were nominal, perhaps an extra portion of the feast or a small handicraft. But the real reward was the break from routine and the shared experience of play. As darkness fell, the celebration moved indoors to the larger homes in the village, where people continued to socialize until late in the evening. Candles were lit, a rare extravagance saved for special occasions, and music filled the winter night. For the Fletcher family, like all medieval households, these community entertainments provided essential balance to the hardships of winter. The shared stories, games, music, and celebrations created resilience, helping people endure cold, scarcity, and darkness by reminding them they were not alone in their struggles. As they walked home from the Epiphany feast, stars once again brilliant overhead, Thomas put his arm around Emma's shoulders. "A good day," he said simply. She nodded, understanding all he meant by those few words. In the harsh reality of medieval winter, a good day was one where hunger was temporarily forgotten, where laughter outweighed worry, where community bonds were strengthened against challenges still to come. The winter was far from over. The hardest months, February and March, still lay ahead when food stores would run lowest and patience would wear thinnest. But the social fabric of the village, reinforced through shared entertainment and celebration, would help carry them through to spring. January gave way to February. February arrived with the weight of inevitability. The starving time had come. This was what medieval peasants called it, had called it for generations, would call it for generations to come. The starving time. Those weeks between mid-February and late April when stored food ran lowest, when bodies grew weak from reduced rations, when death lurked closest. The morning of Candlemas, February 2nd, dawned grey and forbidding, the sky the colour of old iron. Thomas woke with a heaviness in his chest that had nothing to do with the weather. It was the weight of responsibility, the burden of keeping his family alive through the most dangerous part of winter. As he kindled the day's fire from carefully preserved embers, as he had done every morning for months now, he ran the calculations again in his head. He'd been running these same calculations for weeks, hoping the numbers would somehow come out differently, knowing they wouldn't. The grain stores, the salted meat, the root vegetables, the cheese, divided by 5 people, divided by roughly 90 days until the first spring greens would be edible. The math was simple and brutal. "The grain is low," he told Emma quietly when she joined him at the fire, keeping his voice low so the children wouldn't hear. Though they would hear eventually. They would see it in the portions that grew smaller, in the meals that grew further apart. But there was no point in worrying them before necessary. "We have perhaps 3 weeks of full rations, maybe a month if we stretch it carefully. Then we must stretch it further. 3 weeks of eating normally, then months of slow starvation, rationing what remained, hoping it would last until spring provided relief." She nodded, unsurprised. This was the rhythm of medieval winter. Abundance at its beginning, careful management in its middle, potential scarcity at its end. The period from February until first spring harvests in May or June was historically the most dangerous time of year. "The dried peas will help," she said, "and we still have 2 wheels of cheese." Thomas appreciated her practical response. No point dwelling on what couldn't be changed. The food they'd preserved in autumn was what they had. No more could be acquired until spring brought new growth. As if to emphasize the challenges ahead, 6-year-old Agnes woke coughing. Her small face flushed with fever. "Not again," Emma murmured, going to feel her daughter's forehead. The little girl had suffered from winter coughs for as long as she'd been alive, each cold season bringing at least one bout of respiratory illness. Medieval people didn't understand germs or viruses, but they recognized patterns. Winter confinement, multiple people living in close quarters, breathing smoky air with limited ventilation, inevitably led to illness. Children and elderly were most vulnerable. Every winter claimed lives from pneumonia, influenza, and other respiratory diseases. Emma immediately began treatment based on generations of folk medicine. She steeped pine needles in hot water to create a tea rich in vitamin C, though she wouldn't have understood the chemistry. She mixed honey with herbs to soothe Agnes's throat and suppress her cough. Most importantly, she kept the child warm and encouraged her to drink frequently. "Should we call for Father Stephen?" Thomas asked, concern evident in his voice. The priest served as the closest thing to a doctor available to peasant families. Emma considered, placing her hand on Agnes's chest to feel her breathing. Not yet. The fever isn't too high, and her breathing isn't laboured. This assessment, watching carefully for the difference between a common winter illness and a life-threatening one, was crucial skill for medieval parents. Without modern medicine, they relied on observation, experience, and inherited knowledge to determine when illness required intervention beyond home remedies. The family adjusted their routine to accommodate Agnes's care. Margaret took over more household tasks. William assumed additional responsibilities outside. Thomas checked their store of dried herbs, making sure they had enough of the plants traditionally used to treat winter coughs. Medieval medicine combined practical remedies that often had real medicinal properties with religious and superstitious elements. Emma might brew tea using herbs with genuine medicinal effects, while also placing a blessed candle near Agnes's bed. Thomas might apply a poultice of effective medicinal plants while saying prayers for healing. In their world, physical and spiritual aspects of healing were inseparable. By the next day, Agnes's fever had broken, though her cough persisted. Emma continued treatments, adding a cough syrup made from honey, herbs, and a small amount of their precious store of ale. The alcohol helped extract beneficial compounds from herbs, while also having mild sedative properties that helped the child rest. While Agnes recovered, the rest of the family faced ongoing challenges of late winter. The woodpile had diminished significantly, requiring Thomas and William to venture into the forest for more fuel. This task was more difficult than it had been in autumn. Snow made travel arduous. The most accessible deadwood had already been collected. "We'll try near the old oak," Thomas decided as they set out with hand sleds to haul whatever wood they found. There were some fallen branches there that were too green earlier in the season. They might be dry enough now. Firewood quality declined as winter progressed. The best, driest wood was used first, leaving greener or partially rotted pieces for late winter. These burned less efficiently and produced more smoke, adding to the discomfort of indoor confinement. Food supplies followed a similar pattern of declining quality. The best preserved meats and vegetables were often consumed earlier in the season, with less appetizing options saved for lean months. The family's meals grew simpler and more monotonous. Porridge made thinner to stretch grain, soups with fewer chunks of meat, bread that contained increasing proportions of ground peas or beans mixed with diminishing flour. "We should check the beehives," Emma suggested one afternoon in mid-February. "If any colonies survived, they might have honey we could use." Beekeeping was an important aspect of medieval agriculture, providing both honey for sweetening and preservation and beeswax for candles. Most hives remained dormant through winter, with bees clustering inside for warmth. A healthy hive might contain surplus honey that could be carefully harvested even in winter, though beekeepers left enough for the colony to survive until spring flowers bloomed. Thomas and William trudged through snow to check the family's 2 hives, located at the edge of their garden plot. One showed no signs of life. The colony had likely succumbed to cold or disease. But from the second came a faint buzzing when Thomas gently tapped its side. "They're alive in this one," he reported. "We'll leave them be for now. If we're desperate before spring, we can take a small amount of honey, but I'd rather let them keep their stores if possible." This restraint was characteristic of sustainable medieval farming practices. Taking too much honey might mean death of the colony, eliminating not just future honey production, but also the crucial pollination bees provided for fruit trees and other crops. Long-term thinking often overrode immediate needs. As February continued, other challenges emerged. The stored root vegetables began to sprout in their dark storage pit, rapidly losing nutritional value. The last wheel of cheese developed a mouldy spot that had to be carefully cut away. The smoked meat hanging from rafters had been used more quickly than planned due to Agnes's illness and the need for strengthening broths. The Fletcher family was not alone in these late winter struggles. Throughout the village, similar calculations and compromises were being made in every household. This was why medieval communities were so tightly knit. Individual families might face disaster alone, but collective resources and knowledge improved everyone's chances of survival. Evidence of this community approach came one evening when there was a knock at the Fletchers' door. Outside stood John Cooper holding a small package wrapped in cloth. "My wife sent this for Agnes," he said, handing the bundle to Thomas. "It's dried elderberries and the last of our honey. She says to make a syrup for the cough." Thomas accepted the gift with genuine gratitude. Later in winter, such generosity was especially meaningful. The Coopers were giving away food they might need themselves before spring, but this was the unwritten contract of village life. Help given would be help returned when circumstances changed. The gift illustrated another aspect of medieval winter survival: the exchange of specialized knowledge and resources. Different families excelled at different skills or had success with different crops and preservation methods. The Coopers were known for their herb garden and honey. The Fletchers might share their expertise in wood carving or cheese making with neighbours in need. By late February, signs of coming change began to appear. Despite persistent cold, days grew noticeably longer, with darkness falling later each evening. This natural change had practical benefits. Extended daylight meant less fuel used for rushlights and more productive hours for indoor work. "Listen," William said one morning in early March. "Birds." Indeed. The first migratory birds had returned, their songs a promise of spring even as snow still covered the ground. Medieval people were acutely attuned to these natural indicators of seasonal change. They marked time not by calendars but by observing the world around them. Bird migrations, bud formation on trees, changes in weather patterns. "We should check for willow catkins," Thomas suggested. "If they're emerging, we can make willow tea for Agnes's cough." Certain plants, like willow, produced their first growth while winter still held sway. These early signs of life weren't just symbols of hope, but practical resources. Willow contains salicin, a compound similar to aspirin, making it an effective treatment for pain and inflammation. Another example of how medieval folk medicine often had valid scientific foundations. As March progressed, challenges of winter continued, but with an important psychological difference: the visible promise of eventual relief. Snowdrops pushed through melting snow in protected areas. Ice began to break up on the village pond. The quality of light changed, becoming brighter and warmer even on cold days. These signs allowed the family to begin planning for spring activities. Thomas inspected and repaired farm tools that would soon be needed for ploughing and planting. Emma sorted through saved seeds, identifying what they had for the new growing season. William prepared fishing lines and hooks for when streams became accessible again. "We should expand the garden this year," Thomas said during an evening meal of thin barley soup. "Plant more beans and peas. They kept well and filled our bellies this winter." This kind of reflection and planning was a crucial benefit of the winter season. Despite its hardships, winter provided time for medieval families to evaluate what had worked well and what needed improvement without the constant pressure of fieldwork. They could develop strategies for the coming year based on recent experiences. The transitional period between winter and spring, roughly from mid-March through April, brought its own unique challenges. Weather became highly unpredictable with warm spring-like days followed by brutal cold snaps. Melting snow created mud that made travel difficult and increased risk of flooding in low-lying areas. Food supplies reached their lowest point during this transition. The Fletchers, like most families, had exhausted most of their stored provisions but couldn't yet harvest new crops. This was the true hunger gap, the dangerous weeks when medieval communities were most vulnerable to starvation. "We'll thin the porridge more," Emma decided as she assessed their remaining grain in late March, "and send William to check the early fishing spots. The ice might be breaking up enough for him to catch something." Strategies for surviving this final phase of winter included reducing portions, extending meals with foraged plants as they became available, and pursuing fresh food sources like fish as soon as seasonal conditions allowed. Hunting improved as animals emerged from winter hibernation or returned from migration, though game remained lean after scarce winter months. The village as a whole turned to communal approaches during this challenging time. Families with surplus shared with those in need, with understanding that roles might be reversed in future years. The church distributed alms to the poorest households. Labour was exchanged for food. A strong young man might chop wood for an elderly neighbour in exchange for a portion of their remaining preserves. By early April, the first wild greens appeared: dandelions, nettles, other plants dismissed as weeds in modern times, but valued as vital nutrition in the medieval spring. These early plants were rich in vitamins and minerals depleted during winter's limited diet. Emma taught the girls which plants to gather and how to prepare them to remove bitterness while preserving nutrients. "Nettles make the best spring soup," she explained as they carefully harvested the stinging plants using cloth-wrapped hands. "They restore strength after winter weakness." Medieval people didn't understand vitamins or minerals as we do, but they observed the effects of different foods on health. Their traditional spring tonics and cleansing diets often contained exactly the nutrients needed to recover from winter's dietary restrictions. As April advanced, day by day growing warmer and brighter, the pace of change accelerated exponentially. After months of stasis, of frozen stillness, the world suddenly burst into motion and life. The last snow melted except in the deepest shadows, in the north-facing hollows where sunlight never quite reached. The ground, frozen solid for months, began to thaw from the surface down. First just the top inch or two, muddy and soft, then deeper until you could push a stick into the earth without hitting the impenetrable barrier of frost. The soil warmed enough to begin preliminary garden work, though the timing had to be judged carefully. Work the soil too early, when it was still heavy with moisture, and you'd compact it, ruin its structure. Wait too long, and you'd miss the optimal planting window. Medieval farmers knew the signs by instinct and experience. When you could pick up a handful of soil and it crumbled rather than staying in a wet clump, when the robins returned and began pulling worms from the earth, when the willow trees started showing the first hint of green in their branches, then it was time. Livestock that had been kept in close quarters all winter, breathing the same stale air as the humans, treading in their own filth despite best efforts at cleaning, were gradually returned to pasture. Not all at once, because sudden changes in diet could kill an animal as surely as starvation. A few hours of grazing the first day, then back to the barn. Longer the next day, slowly increasing until they were out all day, though still brought in at night when frost threatened. The animal's transformation was remarkable. Cows that had been thin and listless, giving barely any milk, began to fill out as fresh grass replaced winter fodder. Their coats grew glossy, their eyes brightened. The milk production increased day by day until Emma was making cheese again, storing up dairy products for the next winter. The chickens, let out of their dark corner of the house, scattered across the yard, pecking frantically at every insect and seed they could find. Within days they were laying eggs regularly again, beautiful brown eggs that could be eaten fresh or preserved in lime water for later use. For the Fletcher family, the official end of winter came not with a calendar date, but with an action: spring planting. The exact timing varied by crop and by local conditions, by the particular soil and weather patterns of their specific location. But typically it began in late April or early May, depending on the year. The first seeds to go into the ground were always the hardiest, the ones that could tolerate a late frost. Peas and beans, broad beans especially, which could survive a light freeze and actually preferred cool weather for germination. Thomas and William worked together, Thomas breaking the soil with a spade, turning over earth that hadn't been touched since autumn. William following behind, creating furrows with a stick, dropping seeds at careful intervals, covering them with soil. Margaret and Emma worked the garden plot closer to the house, planting herbs and vegetables for the kitchen, onions from sets they'd saved from last year, leeks, the first greens, lettuce and chard that would be ready to eat in just weeks, the first fresh food they'd have after months of preserved stores. The planting of those first seeds was more than agricultural practice. It was an act of faith, a commitment to the future, a statement that winter had ended and the cycle was beginning again. "We made it," Thomas said simply on the evening after they'd planted the first peas and beans. The sun was setting later now, well past 6 o'clock, giving them long hours of working light. They were tired, genuinely physically exhausted in a way that was different from winter's lethargic fatigue. This was the good tiredness that comes from productive physical labour, from muscles used properly after months of relative inactivity. The family sat around the evening fire, not huddled for warmth now, but simply gathered for companionship. The shutters were open, admitting the spring evening air that smelled of earth and growing things rather than smoke and confinement. "We made it," Thomas repeated, and Emma reached over to squeeze his hand. They both knew how close it had been. The grain stores had run out completely in mid-April, forcing them to rely on foraged greens and the last of the root vegetables and the charity of slightly better-off neighbours who'd had more reserves. Agnes had been sick twice more after that first bout of coughing, and the second time had been frightening, her fever soaring, her breathing ragged. But she'd pulled through. They'd all pulled through. There was no elaborate celebration to mark this survival. Medieval people didn't throw festivals to commemorate the end of winter, as they did to mark its beginning. Perhaps because beginnings are hopeful, and endings are simply relief. Perhaps because there wasn't energy or resources to spare for celebration when every bit of strength needed to go into planting and preparation for the growing season. Perhaps because the end of one winter was simply the beginning of preparation for the next. Instead, there was quiet satisfaction, the deep bone-level contentment that comes from having faced death and survived, from having endured hardship and come through on the other side. It wasn't triumphant, it was too weary for triumph, but it was real, and it was earned. The lessons of winter survival were deeply embedded in medieval culture, woven into every aspect of daily life, transmitted from generation to generation through observation and participation, rather than formal instruction. Children absorbed knowledge simply by living, by watching their parents and grandparents, by participating in the work at whatever level their age and strength allowed. They learned how to preserve food by helping with the slaughtering, with the salting and smoking and drying. They learned to conserve fuel by seeing how carefully each log was placed, how the fire was banked at night, how drafts were sealed against. They learned to identify illness by watching their mothers treat sick family members, by hearing which symptoms were dangerous and which would pass on their own. They learned to maintain community bonds during hardship by experiencing the evening gatherings, by seeing neighbours help neighbours, by understanding that no family could survive alone. This practical education was as important as any formal schooling. More important, really, because it prepared each generation for the cyclical challenges they would inevitably face. Reading and writing were luxuries that most peasants could live without, but knowing how to preserve a ham or bank a fire or recognize the early signs of frostbite, these were essential survival skills. For Thomas and Emma, now in their early 40s and considered middle-aged by medieval standards, each winter survived represented both personal resilience and successful transmission of vital knowledge to their children. William, at 14, had grown into his role as the man of the family in training. Throughout the winter he'd taken on increasing responsibilities, and he'd met them all competently. He could bank a fire properly now, could judge how much wood to use in different conditions, could repair tools and maintain the house and care for the animals. He was ready, nearly ready anyway, to start his own household in a few years. Margaret had mastered many of the household skills essential for her future as a wife and mother. She could spin and weave and sew. She could cook and preserve food. She could manage a household's resources, rationing and planning and making supplies stretch. She could nurse the sick using the folk remedies passed down through generations of women. She would make a good match, and the bride price they could command would help the family through a hard year when it came. Even young Agnes, despite her frequent illnesses, had begun learning the seasonal rhythms of survival. She knew without being told when to stay quiet and when activity was permitted. She understood that food was scarce and must not be wasted. She was learning to spin, her small fingers growing more dexterous with the spindle each day. She would carry these lessons forward into her own adulthood, would teach them to her own children in turn. The transmission of knowledge across generations was the key to human survival in the medieval world. More important than any individual skill or trait, each person who survived carried the accumulated wisdom of all their ancestors who had also survived, an unbroken chain of knowledge stretching back countless generations. As April turned to May, as the landscape transformed from brown to green almost overnight, winter became a memory rather than an immediate reality. A recent memory, still vivid, still carrying emotional weight, but no longer the all-consuming present reality that had dominated every thought and action for months. The Fletcher home, so absolutely central to survival during the cold months, The boundary between life and death, the shell that had protected them from the killing cold, now became simply a place to sleep and store things and eat during bad weather. Most of their activities moved outdoors, into the spring sunshine, into the fresh air that no longer hurt to breathe. The windows were unshuttered permanently now, flung wide to admit fresh air and light after months of smoky darkness. The house itself seemed to breathe, seemed to relax, as if it too had been holding itself tense against the cold, and was now releasing that tension. The central hearth was used mainly for cooking now rather than constant heating. The fire burned smaller, with less fuel, allowed to go out completely during the day sometimes, a thing that would have been unthinkable in February. The family's focus shifted entirely, dramatically, to growth and abundance, every thought, every action oriented toward production rather than conservation. Planting crops in the carefully prepared fields and garden plots, tending animals who were suddenly thriving on fresh pasture, beginning the cycle of food production that would sustain them through the next winter, that inevitable winter that was already lurking in the back of everyone's mind, even as they sweated in the spring sunshine. But the experiences of the cold months remained present in their planning and decision-making, influencing every choice they made about what to plant and when and how much. Each farming decision was made with winter in mind, with memory of recent hunger making the choices clear. Which crops stored best? Turnips and parsnips over beets and carrots, dried beans over fresh vegetables, grains that could be ground into flour and made into bread that would last for weeks. Plant more of those, even if they weren't the most pleasant to eat, because pleasant didn't matter in February when the alternative was starvation. Which animals could be maintained through scarcity? The cow that gave milk even in winter, fed on carefully hoarded hay. The chickens that still laid occasional eggs. The pig that could be slaughtered right before winter and transformed into months of preserved meat. Plan for those animals, allocate resources to support them, because they were the difference between adequate nutrition and slow starvation. How much fuel would be needed when cold returned? More than last year, because last year they'd cut it closer than Thomas wanted to admit. Start gathering wood now, in spring and summer when deadfall was easier to find and haul. Stack it where it would stay dry. Always be thinking ahead to winter. Always be preparing, because winter's coming was as certain as death. This constant awareness of winter, even in summer's abundance, was perhaps the most profound difference between medieval life and our modern experience. Today we move between seasons with relatively little preparation, our basic needs met regardless of weather, food available year-round, heat at the turn of a dial, light at the flick of a switch. For Thomas Fletcher and his family, for every medieval peasant family across Europe, the shadow of winter was always present, always looming, always influencing every decision and every action throughout the year. The survival of a medieval winter required an intricate combination of elements that we in the modern world can barely comprehend. It required physical strength and endurance, the ability to work long hours in brutal conditions, to endure cold and hunger and exhaustion. It required practical knowledge accumulated over generations, passed down from parent to child through demonstration and oral tradition. The knowledge of which woods burned hottest, and which created the most smoke, which herbs treated which illnesses, how to judge when meat had cured properly and when it had spoiled, how to bank a fire to last through the night, when to slaughter animals and when to keep them alive, how to read the signs of changing weather in the behavior of animals and the color of the sky. It required careful planning and the ability to delay gratification, to save resources now for use later, to resist the temptation to consume abundance when it appeared, and instead preserve it for scarcity. To think not in terms of days, but of months, not in terms of immediate comfort, but of long-term survival. It required social cooperation on a scale that's difficult for our individualistic society to understand. The medieval village functioned as a single organism in many ways, with each family depending on all the others for survival. The web of reciprocal obligations, the sharing of labour and resources, the collective knowledge and collective action that made survival possible. No family could make it through winter alone. The very concept of rugged individualism would have seemed not just foolish, but suicidal. It required psychological resilience, the ability to endure months of confinement, monotony, discomfort, and fear without breaking. To maintain hope when the food ran low and spring seemed impossibly distant. To find joy and meaning in small moments, to tell stories and sing songs and maintain the human spirit even when the body was cold and hungry. Medieval people possessed all of these qualities not because they were superior to us in any way, but because they had to. Because the alternative was death. Because natural selection had been brutal and unforgiving, winnowing out those who couldn't adapt, couldn't endure, couldn't survive. Their lives were harder than we can truly imagine. Harder than most of us could endure if we were suddenly transported back in time. The constant physical labour, the chronic pain from injuries that never healed properly, the hunger that was a baseline condition of existence, the cold that seeped into your bones and never fully left, the smoke that burned your eyes and lungs, the parasites and diseases, the infant mortality, the violence, the uncertainty. Yet within this harsh existence they found ways not just to endure but to create meaning, to build communities, to preserve knowledge, to raise children, to love and laugh and hope. They told stories around winter fires, they sang songs while working, they celebrated feast days with genuine joy, they formed deep bonds of friendship and love. They found beauty in small things, in a frost pattern on a window, in the first snowdrop of spring, in a well-cooked meal shared with family. They were fully human, with all the complexity and contradiction that entails. They weren't simple or primitive or less intelligent than we are. They were people, just like us, dealing with challenges we can barely comprehend using tools and knowledge that seem inadequate to us but were sophisticated for their time. As we settle into our comfortable beds tonight, in our temperature-controlled homes, with refrigerators full of food and cupboards stocked with supplies, with medical care available at any hour, with all the security and abundance and comfort that modern technology provides, perhaps we can take a moment to appreciate what we have, not to feel guilty about it, not to romanticize the past or wish we lived in simpler times. The past wasn't simpler, it was harder, much harder, but to appreciate the warmth that surrounds us, the safety we take for granted, the abundance that seems normal but would have seemed miraculous to Thomas Fletcher and his family. To understand that what we consider basic necessities, the baseline of acceptable living conditions, represent luxuries that our ancestors could barely imagine. To remember that every generation of our ancestors survived long enough to reproduce, creating an unbroken chain of survival stretching back thousands of years, that we are the inheritors of their resilience, their ingenuity, their refusal to give up even when circumstances seemed hopeless. Thomas Fletcher and Emma and their children represent millions of families who survived countless winters through knowledge, preparation, community, and sheer stubborn determination. They represent the human capacity to adapt and endure, to find hope in darkness, to make it through to spring, to plant again, to continue the cycle. Winter always came, winter was inevitable, but so was spring. And that knowledge, that certainty that the seasons would turn, that cold and hunger and darkness were temporary conditions that would pass, that the world would green again and warm again and provide again, that knowledge sustained them through the hardest times. Close your eyes now. Feel the warmth of your blankets. Hear the gentle hum of your heating system. Know that you are safe and warm and fed. Know that you will wake tomorrow to the same security, and perhaps, as you drift off to sleep, spare a thought for Thomas Fletcher and all those like him, enduring the medieval winter that we will never have to face. Sleep well, sleep warm. The winter you'll never survive has ended, and spring eternal awaits in your comfortable modern dreams.